Welcome, if this is your first time watching Who Remembers, the series where we discuss and break down my thoughts on games that are at least 10 years old or older. Some we are revisiting, and some we are playing for the first time. I'll try to keep it mostly spoiler-free by avoiding any major plot points. So let's get started. What an interesting feeling sitting down to write a script about a game where a novelist is playing out stories he wrote. Just thought I'd share that little notion before we begin. Alan Wake is considered by many as a cult classic. Originally released in 2010 by Remedy Entertainment, who also made the Max Payne games. The darker undertones from those games are definitely carried over to Alan Wake, creating a tense and spooky atmosphere right out of the gate. The game takes place in Bright Falls, which is ironic because there's nothing bright about it. Bright Falls is a Pacific Northwest town with that classic moody P&W vibe. I've lived in the Seattle area for 5 years now, and the cloudy, rainy, mossy environment is pretty on point with the aesthetic. You'll be spending a lot of time in the woods surrounded by tall trees, steep cliff drop-offs, and running rivers. Since you'll be spending majority of your time in the dark, light becomes your lifeline. Reaching streetlights and other light sources will heal Alan and provide the player with a save state/checkpoint. Generators are also spread out throughout the game. These generators are a godsend in desperate times of need, when you're overwhelmed by the enemy. Like I stated at the beginning, Alan Wake is playing out the stories from the books he's written. He's basically in his own horror film. The game takes you through each chapter and does a recap of the previous chapter at the start of the next one. I'd also like to point out this is my first time playing Alan Wake. As a horror fan, it's been on my radar for some time now, and a few months ago I almost bought the remastered version, but decided to hold off. Luckily for me, a few weeks later I ran across the original Xbox 360 version at my local Goodwill. So, it was a no-brainer to pick it up for $3.99. And I must say, graphically, it still holds up nicely compared to today's standards. Alan Wake overall is a cinematic masterpiece. The lighting effects and sound design are truly special and way ahead of its time. The way the light moves through the trees, the haunting sound of the wind and creaky old floorboards will send chills down your spine. The shadows play games with your mind as you slowly make your way through the dark forest.
What the hell was that?
You'll never really know which direction the next enemy is coming from, consistently putting the player on edge, wondering if someone is sneaking up behind you. Making your flashlight your ally. In order to defeat enemies and cause damage, you'll need to weaken the enemy first by using your flashlight on them. It's a unique aspect to the gameplay and creates very intense moments when facing multiple enemies at once. Think of it as having to break a shield or barrier on an enemy before you can hurt them. Personally, I found this element as refreshing and ahead of its time for 2010. Not only are you managing your own ammo, but your light source as well. It's absolutely different, but Alan Wake has a bit of Silent Hill vibe to it. So far, I've mostly touched on gameplay and atmosphere, but I wanted to pivot to the story and narrative. The story of Alan Wake begins with Alan and his wife heading out for a vacation in the Pacific Northwest. Alan, a journalist, has been suffering from writer's block for nearly 2 years. I mean, damn, I'd probably need a vacation too. Or a career change. The vacation quickly turns into a nightmare when Alan's wife is kidnapped by a mysterious, dark, unseen matter. Alan is now trapped within the darkness and must fight his way through the many dark chapters in an attempt to find and rescue his wife. Now, these videos are intended to be mostly spoiler-free, so I won't be doing any deep dives into the story, but the story is unique and captivating throughout, creating an addictive narrative, leaving the player always wanting more and more. One of my favorite things about Alan Wake is how you uncover the story. You see, throughout each chapter, Alan finds missing pages from the books he's written in order to discover certain details within the story, and furthermore, forecast what is ahead of you on your journey through the darkness. This creates even more tension when you are now anticipating what's around the next corner. I really like this kind of storytelling. It reminds me a lot of Resident Evil. But instead, your notes are actually piecing together the story you wrote, which encourages the player to explore and seek out the notes throughout the game. It's really up to you. Do you want a glimpse into the future or the past? Or do you prefer to just go in blind? Aside from the story, the cinematics are stunning. I couldn't wait to get to the next cutscene. You see, I'm a big story guy. A matter of fact, I'm all about story in video games. Yes, of course, I love good gameplay, but a lot of games have good gameplay. But a great story with beautiful cutscenes and great voiceover is really damn hard to beat. Give me something that'll last. Something I'll remember for 10, 20, 30 years. That's the shit I want in video games and movies. Alan Wake falls into that category in my personal opinion. One of my favorite things about creating the Who Remembers series is the fact that I get to go back and experience all these amazing titles from the past that are loved by so many, and finally I get to see why. You see, I always knew I'd love Alan Wake way before I even played it. Certain titles just speak to you, and Alan Wake was one of those for me. I love horror, mystery, moody atmosphere, unique gameplay, great lighting, good sound design. And of course, a great story. I also love games and movies that are hard to put into a category. For example, many don't consider Alan Wake a horror game, and that's fine. I'd respectfully disagree. I think it's a psychological horror game with some action-adventure elements. Yes, there are some cheap jump scares, but most of the horror is a slow burn, and I love that. It takes its time and makes the player patiently wait. It's a classic thriller in that sense. Anyone can throw a bunch of gore and violence on the screen, but a lot of times that has no substance. It's also something I'll probably never revisit, but something that builds the tension and makes you wait is something I'm all about. Because sometimes nothing happens, and that's the beauty of it. It keeps you guessing, it keeps you on your toes. The pacing overall is great. I never felt like anything was dragging on or overstaying its welcome. Environments had enough variety, but most of the game you are in the woods. I only have a few small complaints. First one being enemy variety. Most of the enemies are the same outside of a few larger, stronger enemies which act as a sort of mini-boss, I guess you would say. But I really wouldn't say the game has legit boss fights. My second complaint was the ending. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I'll just say it was a little underwhelming, and I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to be honest about that, but it's still a great game, and I'd highly recommend it for anyone that's a fan of psychological horror. The length of Alan Wake is perfect at around 10 to 12 hours on your first playthrough. I really look forward to picking up the recently remastered version for PS4, which also includes the DLC for the Signal and the Rider. The remastered version also includes enhancements to the graphics, gameplay, and frame rate. If you're undecided on playing the original or remaster, I would just go with the cheaper option for $360. If you already have a 360, you can normally find it for around $10. I do plan on playing Alan Wake 2, but I want to finish the DLC beforehand. I'd also be lying if I said I'm okay with Alan Wake 2 being digital only, because I'm not. I'm a physical collector and always will be as long as I can be. Since it's digital only, I'll probably wait for a flash sale and pick it up for a big discount. All in all, thank you for voting for Alan Wake in the community poll. You gave me an opportunity to play this cult classic and finally experience it for myself. Alan Wake truly deserves all the praise it received over the years. Just 2 years after launch, Remedy reported over 200 million in sales. IGN gave it a 9 out of 10, describing it as hard to put down once you started. My experience was very similar. It was a refreshing game for the genre, and one that will stick with me for the years to come. I'm already counting my days until my next visit to Bright Falls, and furthermore, the sequel. I'd like to say thank you once again for the support for this channel and this series. If you made it this far, you're a real one and I appreciate it. Comment down below, Alan Wake Up, if you made it to the end. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy scenic drives down memory lane. Hope to see you in the next video. Stay blessed.